The morning after my son's funeral, my phone rang. The caller ID said Newark Liberty International Airport. A trembling security supervisor whispered that my son had checked in for a flight at 4 in the morning, 2 days after he supposedly burned to death in a car crash. He left a bag with my name on it. I drove there with my chest pounding. Inside that bag, I found a pristine passport with a stranger's face, $80,000 in banded cash, and a digital voice recorder. I hit play. My son's terrified voice filled the quiet room, warning me that his grieving widow was actually trying to murder him. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the truth always comes to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. The last of the funeral guests finally trickled out of my house, leaving behind the suffocating smell of stale coffee, wilted lilies, and forced sympathy. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 years calculating load-bearing walls and structural integrity as an engineer, but nothing prepared me for the weight of burying my only child. I stood in the center of my kitchen, my bones aching, staring at the empty catering trays. I just wanted to sit in my armchair and close my eyes. But the front door clicked shut, and the heavy silence of the house was instantly shattered by a completely different kind of coldness. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, did not look like a grieving widow anymore. The tearful, fragile woman who had just spent 3 hours accepting hugs from our neighbors vanished the second the last guest drove away. She walked into the kitchen, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp and calculating. She tossed her black veil onto the marble island with casual disdain. She did not offer me a glass of water. She did not ask how I was holding up. She reached into her designer leather tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She slapped them down on the marble surface right in front of me. The loud smack echoed in the quiet kitchen. I looked down. The top page clearly read, "Quitclaim deed." I looked back up at her, my mind struggling to process the shift in reality. Vanessa leaned forward, planting her perfectly manicured hands on the counter. Her voice was not trembling anymore. It was dead level and entirely devoid of warmth. She told me that Cameron had left them in massive, insurmountable debt. She claimed his real estate startup was a complete failure, a sinking ship that he had hidden from everyone, and the creditors were already circling. She said they were coming for everything, including my home. I stood there listening to her lie. I knew the startup was struggling, but I also knew the financial bedrock of that company was built on my own blood and sweat. 3 years ago, I sold my entire engineering firm, the business I built from nothing, just to fund Cameron and Vanessa's dream. I handed them the bulk of my life savings, keeping only my modest pension, and the deed to this house, the house where I raised my son with my late wife. I had sacrificed my financial security for them. And now, barely 24 hours after my son was reduced to ashes in a closed casket, she was demanding the last remaining piece of my life. Vanessa tapped a manicured fingernail against the signature line of the document. She told me that to protect her future and the future of the child she was carrying, I needed to sign the house over to her immediately. She claimed she had legal loopholes to shield the property from Cameron's fictional creditors, but only if the house was in her name. If I refused, she promised she would vanish. She swore I would never see her again, and I would never meet my unborn grandchild. She weaponized my grief and my hope in the same breath. She was trying to extort a grieving father while the dirt on his son's grave was still fresh. I looked at the silver pen she slid across the counter. My hand shook, not from sorrow, but from a sudden, terrifying realization of who this woman truly was. I reached for the pen. I felt the cold metal against my fingers. The pressure in the room was immense. She stood over me, a predator waiting for the final kill. I uncapped the pen. Just as the ink touched the thick paper, my cell phone vibrated violently against the marble counter. The sudden noise made Vanessa flinch. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID flashed Newark Liberty International Airport baggage security. I froze. Cameron's car crash had been ruled an accident on a lonely stretch of highway. There was no reason for airport security to be calling my personal number. I put the pen down. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, demanding I ignore it. But my gut, the instinct that had kept me alive and solvent for 7 decades, screamed at me to answer. I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear. The voice on the other end was frantic, hushed, and terrified. A baggage supervisor asked if I was Lawrence. When I confirmed, he told me I needed to come to Terminal C immediately. He said he had something that belonged to my son. He said it was a matter of life and death. The scene in my kitchen snapped shut. I looked at Vanessa, my face perfectly blank. I told her it was the funeral home, that there was a problem with the billing. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door, leaving the unsigned deed on the marble counter. The drive to Newark Liberty was a blur of highway lights and pounding rain. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow. My mind raced through 1,000 impossible scenarios. A structural engineer does not believe in ghosts. We believe in physics, in tangible evidence, in things we can measure and prove. But the voice on the phone had been so specific, so utterly terrified. I bypassed the normal passenger drop-off and followed the supervisor's hurried instructions, navigating through the labyrinth of service roads until I found the unmarked security entrance behind Terminal C. I parked my old sedan in a loading zone, not caring if it got towed. I walked through the sliding glass doors, my shoes squeaking on the wet linoleum floor. A man in a blue security uniform was waiting for me. He looked nervous, constantly checking the hallway behind him. He did not ask for my ID. He just looked at my face, recognized the resemblance, and pulled me quickly into a windowless back office. The room smelled of ozone and cheap floor cleaner. He locked the door behind us. He turned to me, his hands shaking slightly. He whispered that he was breaking federal protocol by showing me this, but his conscience would not let it go. He walked over to a metal desk and tapped the keyboard of a secure terminal. A green screen flared to life. He pointed a trembling finger at the monitor. It was a flight manifest for a one-way trip to Zurich, Switzerland. The boarding time was 4:15 in the morning, 2 days after my son's car was found incinerated on the highway. He pointed to the passenger name. It was not Cameron. It was a man named Arthur Vance. But then the supervisor clicked another button and the security camera footage from the boarding gate popped up. The camera angle was high, looking down at the passengers handing their tickets to the agent. The video was grainy, but the man in the frame was unmistakable. He was wearing a heavy coat and a baseball cap pulled low, but the slope of his shoulders, the way he favored his left knee from an old college football injury, the exact angle of his jaw. It was Cameron. My heart stopped. I stopped breathing. I stared at the screen, my mind fracturing. My son was alive. He had walked onto an airplane while I was picking out his casket. The supervisor spoke again, his voice barely a murmur over the hum of the computer fan. He said the man scanned his boarding pass, but right before he walked down the jet bridge, he panicked. He dropped his carry-on bag at the podium and ran toward the emergency exit. He vanished into the concourse before security could stop him. The flight took off without him. The supervisor reached under the desk and pulled out a heavy black canvas duffel bag. It had a yellow paper tag tied to the handle. Written in thick black marker in handwriting I had known since my son was in elementary school were the words, "Deliver to Lawrence." The supervisor placed the bag on the metal desk and pushed it toward me. He told me he hadn't logged it into the system yet. He told me to take it and leave, that he didn't want any part of whatever this was. I unzipped the heavy canvas. The metal teeth of the zipper sounded like a chainsaw in the quiet room. I pulled the fabric apart. The first thing I saw was a navy blue passport. I picked it up and flipped it open. It bore the name Arthur Vance, but the photograph staring back at me was my son. Beneath the passport were thick, tight bundles of cash, $100 bills wrapped in crisp bank bands. I didn't need to count it to know it was a small fortune, easily $80,000. My hands felt numb. My brain could not reconcile the grieving father I was, an hour ago, with the man standing in this secure room holding a dead man's escape fund. I dug deeper into the bag. Beneath a layer of clothes, my fingers brushed against cold, hard plastic. I pulled it out. It was a small black digital voice recorder, the kind journalists use. It felt heavy in my palm. The red recording light was off, but the screen indicated there was one saved audio file. I looked up at the supervisor. He was already opening the door, signaling for me to leave. I packed everything back into the duffel bag, zipped it tight, and walked out of the airport. I did not drive home. I drove to the top level of the airport parking garage, a desolate concrete structure exposed to the freezing rain. I parked my car in the darkest corner I could find, cut the engine, and locked the doors. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. I placed the black duffel bag on the passenger seat. I held the digital voice recorder in both hands. My thumbs hovered over the play button. I was terrified of what I was about to hear. I pressed the button. There was a second of static, the sound of heavy breathing, and then Cameron's voice filled the cold car. It was frantic, panicked, and echoing, as if he had recorded it in a bathroom or a closet. He started by apologizing. He begged me to forgive him for the pain he was causing me. He said he had no choice. He said he had to disappear because Vanessa was trying to kill him. I squeezed my eyes shut, the words hitting me like physical blows. Cameron's recorded voice began to outline a nightmare. He explained that Vanessa's real estate startup was never a legitimate business. It was a massive, highly illegal mortgage fraud syndicate. She had been using the money I gave them to forge property deeds, take out massive fraudulent loans on non-existent properties, and funnel the cash into offshore accounts. She was laundering millions. But the federal auditors had started asking questions. The syndicate was on the verge of collapsing, and Vanessa needed a scapegoat. Cameron confessed that he had found out too late. When he confronted her, she didn't deny it. Instead, she took out a $5 million life insurance policy on him, forging his signature on the medical documents. Then she started poisoning his morning coffee. She was using small doses of antifreeze, an untraceable method designed to trigger a massive fatal heart attack that would look entirely natural given our family history of heart disease. Cameron had found the empty vials hidden in the garage. He realized she wasn't just planning to blame him for the fraud, she was planning to bury him and collect the insurance money to fund her escape. He knew if he went to the police, she would have him killed before he reached the station. Her syndicate partners were ruthless and connected. His only option was to die before she could murder him. He explained how he bought the wreckage of a similar car from a junkyard, rigged it to blow, and left his dental records in the front seat. It was a desperate, sloppy plan, but it bought him time. He told me the $80,000 in the bag was to help me survive what was coming next. He warned me that Vanessa still needed a fall guy for the corporate debt. Since I was the original investor in her company, she was going to try and seize my assets. She was going to come for my house. I opened my eyes. I was sitting in my dark car, the heater off my breath pluming in the cold air. The recording was nearing its end. Cameron's voice broke. He told me he loved me. And then he gave me his final, most urgent instruction. He said I could not go to the police yet. I had no hard evidence, only a tape that Vanessa's lawyers would claim was a deep fake. He told me I had to play dead. I had to let her think she had won. I had to let her think I was a broken, senile old man. I had to wait until she made a fatal mistake. The recording clicked off. The silence returned heavier and darker than before. I sat there absorbing the absolute betrayal. The woman who had cried on my shoulder at the cemetery was a monster who had tried to murder my son. She had taken my money, my business, and nearly my child. Now she was coming for my home. A profound, icy calm washed over me. The grief evaporated, replaced by the precise, calculating mind of an engineer. I understood the load-bearing walls of Vanessa's life. I knew exactly where to strike to bring her entire world crashing down. I reached forward to start the engine. As I turned the key, a flash of headlights caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A black luxury SUV was slowly rolling down the aisle of the parking garage, its headlights sweeping across the concrete pillars. I recognized the license plate immediately. It was Vanessa. She hadn't stayed at my house. She had tracked the GPS signal on my cell phone. She had followed me to the airport. She was hunting me. I ducked down below the dashboard, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched her vehicle idle near the elevators, unaware that I was parked 50 yards away in the shadows. The trap was set. She thought she was hunting a wounded animal. She did not know she had just triggered the silent, ruthless adjustment of an old man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I stayed crouched beneath the dashboard as the heavy tires of Vanessa's luxury vehicle rolled to a stop just a few spaces away. The heavy slam of her car door echoed through the concrete cavern. I heard the sharp click of her designer heels marching deliberately toward my old sedan. She knew exactly where I was. She slapped the palm of her hand against my driver's side window. The sudden violence of the sound made me jump. I slowly raised my head and unlocked the door. Vanessa ripped it open before I could even reach for the handle. The cold airport wind whipped her hair around her face, but her eyes were entirely focused and furious. She leaned into the cabin, invading my space, her perfume masking the smell of exhaust and rain. She demanded to know what on earth I was doing. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a toxic, vibrating intensity. She asked why I had run out of my own home in the middle of a conversation about my financial survival. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest, accusing me of trying to hide assets from the creditors. She wanted to know who I was meeting at the airport. She scanned the empty passenger seat, completely unaware that the black duffel bag holding her destruction was shoved tightly underneath it, resting against my boots. She crossed her arms, demanding an explanation for my erratic behavior, telling me that I was acting like a guilty man. She reminded me that we had pressing legal matters to attend to, and that my little disappearing act was costing her patience and money. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, asking me directly if someone had called me about Cameron. She was fishing for information, trying to figure out if the police or the insurance investigators had contacted me before her. The sheer audacity of her standing there wearing a black morning dress while actively hunting the man she had tried to murder was suffocating. I stared at her angry, expectant face. I knew that if I showed even a fraction of the burning clarity I felt inside, she would realize I knew everything. I had to bury the engineer. I had to become the broken old man she desperately needed me to be. I let my shoulders collapse. I forced my hands to start shaking violently, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I looked past her, staring blankly at the concrete pillar behind her vehicle. I opened my mouth, letting my jaw tremble, and pushed a shallow, ragged gasp up from my chest. I asked her what time it was. My voice was intentionally weak, thin, and lost. Vanessa blinked, clearly thrown off by the sudden shift in my demeanor. She impatiently snapped that it was nearly midnight and demanded I answer her questions. I ignored her anger and started frantically patting my coat pockets, pretending to search for something I had lost. I told her I was going to be late. I told her the flight was supposed to land at 11:30, and I could not find the gate number. I looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes, letting a single tear roll down my cheek. I asked her if she had seen Cameron. I told her he texted me to pick him up from his business trip in Chicago, and that he would be furious if I left him waiting at the baggage claim. The transformation in Vanessa was instantaneous and chilling. The furious predator vanished, replaced by a dark, triumphant satisfaction. She stared at my trembling hands and my confused, tear-stained face. She did not see a man executing a calculated tactical maneuver. She saw a traumatized, aging mind finally snapping under the unbearable weight of grief. She believed that the shock of the funeral had completely broken my tether to reality. She let out a long, slow exhale. The tension left her shoulders. She reached out and placed a gentle, patronizing hand on my arm. The fake warmth in her voice returned, sickeningly sweet and deeply condescending. She told me softly that Cameron was not coming. She spoke to me as if I were a lost toddler. She reminded me that we just buried him this morning. I shook my head violently, slapping her hand away, playing the role of a combative dementia patient. I insisted that she was lying. I pointed a trembling finger at the terminal doors, shouting that my son was in there waiting for me. I leaned over and tried to turn the key in the ignition, intentionally fumbling the keys and dropping them onto the floorboard right next to the hidden duffel bag. I collapsed back into the seat, burying my face in my hands, and let out a loud, pathetic sob. I cried out for my boy. Vanessa stood back and watched my performance. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. A legally incompetent, mentally unstable father-in-law was infinitely easier to manipulate than a stubborn, lucid one. She reached down, picked up my keys from the floorboard without noticing the bag, and put them in her pocket. She told me I was in no condition to drive. She said she was going to call a car service to take me home and that tomorrow she would arrange for a doctor to come look at my memory. She promised she would take care of absolutely everything. I stayed buried in my hands, continuing to sob, while a cold, absolute victory settled deep in my chest. She had completely taken the bait. Vanessa slowly pulled her hand back from my shoulder. I could feel the cold radiating from her. She let out a long breath, but it was not a sigh of relief or empathy. It was the sound of a predator settling into a comfortable position after realizing the prey was already trapped. She leaned against the side of my car, crossing her arms over her expensive black morning coat. She looked down at me, curled over the steering wheel, and her face softened into a mask of absolute terrifying pity. She spoke to me in a voice so sweet, it made my stomach turn. She told me that grief does terrible things to the mind. She said it was completely understandable that my brain was trying to protect me from the reality of losing my only child. She was speaking to me the way one might speak to a frightened dog. I kept my face hidden in my hands, letting out occasional weak sobs, but my mind was recording every nuance of her tone. She was enjoying this. She was relishing the sight of the strong, independent engineer reduced to a blubbering mess in a freezing airport parking garage. She told me that I did not need to worry about the creditors or the house or the lawyers anymore. She promised that she was going to take the entire burden off my shoulders. She said a man in my delicate mental state could not possibly be expected to make complex financial decisions. She was laying the groundwork right there in the dark. She was subtly establishing my incompetence. She told me she knew a very good private doctor who specialized in trauma and memory care. She said she would have him come to my house first thing in the morning to evaluate me. She promised he would give me something to help me sleep and forget all the stress. I knew exactly what that meant. She was going to get a medical professional on her payroll to declare me legally unfit. Once I was declared incompetent, the quitclaim deed would not even be necessary. She could simply petition the court for full medical and financial guardianship. She would control my pension, my bank accounts, and the house without needing my signature on a single piece of paper. She would have absolute power to sell my home and lock me away in whatever cheap facility she chose. She patted my back one more time, telling me everything was going to be completely fine. She was smiling. I could not see it, but I could hear the smile stretching across her face. She had come here angry and afraid that I knew her secret. Now she was walking away with a guaranteed path to my total destruction. She told me to stay in the car and keep the doors locked while she called a private car service. She said she did not trust me behind the wheel and that she would drive my car back to my house tomorrow. She was systematically stripping away my autonomy piece by piece right in front of me. She truly believed she had won. She stepped away from my window and pulled her phone out of her pocket. She turned her back to me, assuming I was too lost in my own delusions to pay attention to her actions. But the parking garage was incredibly dark, and the bright glow of her phone screen illuminated the space around her. It also reflected perfectly in the polished black paint of the luxury vehicle parked in the spot directly next to us. I slowly parted my fingers and peered through the small gap. I stopped crying immediately. My eyes locked onto the reflection on the dark car door. The text on her screen was large, and the brightness was turned all the way up. I could read the words with absolute clarity. She was typing a message into a group chat. The message said the old man has completely lost his mind. He is hallucinating that Cameron is alive at the airport. We do not need to wait for the deed. I am getting him declared incompetent tomorrow morning. Expedite the eviction notices and get the trust documents ready. We take the house by Friday. I watched the reflection as her thumb hit the send button. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The timeline had just accelerated. I had less than 24 hours before her corrupt doctor showed up at my front door with a heavy dose of sedatives and a legal declaration of insanity. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat. I did not make a sound. I just absorbed the information, letting the cold reality of her text message harden my resolve. She turned back around and tapped on the glass, telling me the car service was 10 minutes away. I nodded weakly, keeping my head down. The private car service dropped me off at my empty house just after 1 in the morning. I walked inside and did not turn on a single light. The silence of the empty rooms was heavy, but I did not have time to feel lonely. I knew Vanessa was watching the global positioning signal on my phone, waiting to see if I would do something unpredictable. I walked into the kitchen and placed my cell phone squarely on the marble island right next to the unsigned quitclaim deed. I left it plugged into the wall charger. To her digital eyes, I was a broken old man safely asleep in my bed. I sat in the dark living room and watched the grandfather clock tick away the minutes. Every swing of the pendulum was a reminder of the ticking clock on my freedom. I waited until exactly 2 in the morning. The neighborhood was dead silent. I went to the hall closet and pulled out my thickest wool winter coat. I picked up the heavy black canvas duffel bag containing the cash and the voice recorder. I slung the thick strap over my shoulder, feeling the immense weight of my son's desperate escape fund. I did not go out the front door. I went out through the back kitchen door, stepping carefully over the creaky floorboards on the wooden patio. I walked through the wet grass of my backyard and slipped quietly through the wooden gate into the dark alleyway. The freezing rain had turned into a steady, icy drizzle soaking through my hat. I walked 6 blocks completely off the digital grid. My knees and shoulders ached with the bitter cold, but my mind was sharper and clearer than it had been in decades. I reached the 24-hour diner out on Elm Street. I did not go inside where the cameras could see my face. I stood in the shadows near the dumpsters in the back. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a handful of silver coins and fed them into the rusted payphone attached to the brick wall. I dialed a local taxi company and gave them a fake name. Then I dialed the private cell phone number of the only attorney in the city I could trust with my life. I had $80,000 in untraceable cash and a dead man's confession. It was time to go to war. The taxi dropped me off in front of a sleek glass high-rise in the downtown financial district. It was nearly 3 in the morning, but the lights on the 42nd floor were blazing. That was the floor belonging to Bradley Foster. Bradley was not just a trust attorney. He was a ruthless corporate liquidator, a man who dismantled fraudulent companies for a living. I walked past the sleepy night security guard, who had clearly been instructed to let me through without asking a single question. I took the express elevator up. When the steel doors slid open, Bradley was waiting for me in the glass-walled lobby. He was wearing a rumpled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking incredibly tired but fiercely alert. He did not offer empty condolences about the funeral or my son. He knew me much better than that. He just looked at the heavy black duffel bag in my hand and nodded toward his private office. I followed him into the massive room overlooking the dark, sleeping city. He poured 2 glasses of bitter black coffee and sat behind his heavy mahogany desk. I unzipped the duffel bag and pulled out the thick, wrapped bundles of $100 bills, tossing them onto the polished wood. Then I placed the digital voice recorder right in the center of the desk and hit play. Bradley listened to Cameron's entire confession without moving a single muscle. He listened to the horrific details of the antifreeze poisoning, the forged $5 million life insurance policy, and the illegal mortgage fraud syndicate. When the recording finally clicked off, the silence in the office was absolute and heavy. Bradley leaned back in his leather chair and stared at the piles of cash. I told him Vanessa was coming for my house tomorrow morning. I told him she had a corrupt doctor ready to declare me mentally incompetent so she could quickly seize my remaining assets and my pension. I told him I needed him to stop her. Bradley looked up at me. His sharp eyes softened just a fraction. 30 years ago, Bradley was a brilliant but desperately poor law student who was about to drop out because he could not afford his final year of tuition. My late wife Diane had met him while volunteering at a free legal clinic. She saw his immense potential. Diane secretly paid his final year of tuition out of her own meager savings, and she never asked for a single penny in return. She only asked that when he became a successful lawyer, he would use his power to protect people who could not protect themselves. Diane passed away 10 years ago, but Bradley Foster never forgot that life-changing debt. He looked at the voice recorder, and then he looked at me. He stated flatly that we were not just going to protect my house. He promised we were going to bury this woman so deep in federal charges she would never see the light of day again. He pulled a thick stack of yellow legal pads out of his drawer and grabbed a heavy gold pen. He asked me exactly how much money was sitting on his desk. I told him it was $80,000 in completely untraceable cash. A feral, calculated smile slowly spread across Bradley's face. He told me that was more than enough capital to buy the exact financial leverage we needed to destroy her. He said by the time the sun came up, I would no longer exist on paper. Bradley walked over to a massive filing cabinet in the corner of his office. He pulled out a thick red folder and dropped it onto the desk right next to the piles of cash. He told me he had been quietly looking into Vanessa and her real estate startup for the past 6 months. He said he had suspicions about their rapid growth, but he never imagined they were running a full-scale mortgage fraud syndicate. He opened the folder and spread several complex financial flowcharts across the mahogany wood. He explained that Vanessa did not get her startup capital from traditional banks. Traditional banks ask too many questions and require too much paperwork. Instead, she borrowed massive amounts of money from unregulated private lenders. These were predatory bridge loans with astronomical interest rates. Bradley pointed to a specific holding company on the flowchart. He said the men who owned this debt were dangerous, but they were also incredibly pragmatic. They did not care about Vanessa or her fake real estate empire. They only cared about getting their initial investment back with a profit. Because the federal auditors were closing in, the syndicate debt was becoming toxic. The private lenders were getting nervous. They wanted out before the entire house of cards collapsed. Bradley looked at the $80,000 sitting on his desk. He told me that in the shadowy world of private debt, cash is the ultimate king. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. It was 3:30 in the morning, but the man on the other end answered on the second ring. Bradley spoke in a low, rapid voice. He used legal terms and financial jargon that I barely understood, but I recognized the tone of a master negotiator cornering his opponent. He told the broker on the phone that he had a client willing to settle the toxic debt of Vanessa and her startup right now. He offered $50,000 in untraceable physical cash in exchange for the total assignment of the promissory notes. The broker hesitated, but Bradley pressed harder. He reminded the man that when the federal agents raided Vanessa, the debt would be completely worthless, and the lenders would be implicated in the fraud. This was their only chance to walk away clean. The man on the phone finally agreed. Bradley hung up the receiver and looked at me with a cold, triumphant smile. He told me the broker was sending the digital transfer documents to his secure server right now. I reached across the desk and counted out $50,000. I stacked the thick bundles of $100 bills, pushing them toward Bradley. I watched as he printed out a massive stack of legal contracts. These were the assignments of debt. They were the chains that bound Vanessa to her ruthless lenders. Bradley handed me his heavy gold pen. He told me to sign on the line labeled primary creditor. I took the pen and signed my name. The ink flowed smoothly across the thick paper. In that single moment, the entire power dynamic of the universe shifted. Vanessa believed she was desperately trying to outrun dangerous criminals. She believed she had to steal my house to pay off ruthless syndicate bosses. She had absolutely no idea that as of 4 a.m, the ruthless syndicate boss was me. I owned her entire company. I owned her fraudulent debt. If she missed a single payment, I had the legal authority to seize every single asset she possessed. I had the power to freeze her bank accounts, to lock the doors of her office, and to force her into total bankruptcy. I had just purchased the absolute control of her life for $50,000, and she was completely blind to it. She was hunting a weak old man while I was quietly building a concrete cage around her. I felt a deep settling calm wash over my tired bones. The engineer in me appreciated the perfect structural integrity of the trap. We had just removed the main load-bearing pillar of her fake empire. Now we just had to protect the bait. I stared at my signature on the assignment of debt. It was a surreal feeling. I had spent my entire life building things. I built bridges and towers. I built a company. I built a home for my family. Now, for the first time in my 70 years, I was actively engineering a demolition. But this was not an act of malice. This was a controlled implosion designed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Bradley carefully gathered the signed documents and placed them in a secure leather portfolio. He told me that Vanessa would receive a generic automated email from the holding company stating that her debt had been transferred to a new private servicing entity. The email would not mention my name. It would look like a standard corporate restructuring. She would ignore it. Her arrogance would not allow her to believe she was in any real danger. She was too focused on her immediate prize. She was too focused on stealing my house. Bradley did not pause to celebrate our victory. He immediately pulled a second stack of documents from his drawer. This stack was entirely different. It was my salvation. He placed a fresh cup of black coffee in front of me and explained the next phase of the strategy. He said buying the debt gave me the sword, but now we needed to forge the shield. He told me about the corrupt doctor Vanessa planned to send to my house in the morning. He warned me that if she successfully declared me mentally incompetent, she would gain immediate control over my personal assets. We had to make sure there were absolutely no assets left for her to take. He slid a document titled Irrevocable Living Trust across the desk. He explained that by signing this document, I would be legally transferring the total ownership of my home and my pension into a private locked trust. I would be the sole beneficiary, but I would no longer be the legal owner. The trust would be managed by his law firm. Once the ink dried, I would become a financial ghost. On paper, I would own absolutely nothing. I would be a penniless old man living in a house owned by a faceless corporate entity. If Vanessa tried to force me to sign a quitclaim deed, it would be completely useless because I no longer had the legal authority to give the house away. If she tried to seize my bank accounts, she would find them entirely empty. I picked up the gold pen one last time. I looked at the legal description of my property. I thought about the decades of memories within those walls. I thought about my late wife, Diane, and the life we built there. I was not losing my home. I was making it bulletproof. I signed my name at the bottom of the page. Bradley stamped the document with his official notary seal. The loud thud of the stamp echoed in the quiet office. It was the sound of a vault slamming shut. I handed the pen back to Bradley and finished my cold coffee. We had successfully hidden my entire life behind a wall of impenetrable legal armor. The silent checkmate was complete. I was a ghost holding all the strings, and Vanessa was walking directly into a void. I sat in the armchair by the window, wearing a faded cardigan, staring blankly at the television. It was the morning after my secret midnight meeting with my lawyer. Vanessa was in the kitchen, aggressively boxing up my late wife's porcelain teacups. She was already packing my life away, confidently preparing for my forced eviction. Then the doorbell rang. It was not a polite ring. It was a firm, authoritative press. Vanessa sighed in annoyance and marched to the front door, yanking it open, ready to yell at a salesman. Instead, a tall man in a sharp gray suit stood on the porch, holding a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Mr. Reed, a senior claims investigator for the global life insurance company. The transformation I witnessed in Vanessa was physically sickening. The harsh scowl melted off her face in a fraction of a second. Her shoulders slumped. Her knees seemed to give way, and her voice cracked into a perfectly pitched whimper. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth and stepped back, inviting him inside with the fragile grace of a woman completely shattered by tragedy. She guided him into the living room, offering him coffee with tears welling in her eyes. I remained perfectly still in my armchair, keeping my gaze fixed on the muted television screen. I knew exactly why Mr. Reed was here. Insurance companies do not write $5 million checks for single car accidents without asking a lot of questions. Car fires are notorious for destroying evidence, and a sudden death policy of that magnitude triggers automatic federal flags. Vanessa sat on the sofa directly across from him, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. She told him how much she missed Cameron, how the house felt so empty without him, and how she was trying to stay strong for her unborn child. She was laying the emotional manipulation on thick, hoping to guilt the investigator into closing the file quickly. But Mr. Reed did not look moved. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick file, and clicked his pen. He stated plainly that the preliminary police report left several anomalies regarding the intense heat of the fire and the specific route Cameron was driving that night. He told her he needed to ask some difficult questions before the funds could be released. Vanessa stiffened when Mr. Reed mentioned the anomalies of the fire. I could see the tiny muscle in her jaw flex, but her weeping widow mask remained firmly in place. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She told Mr. Reed that she had not wanted to mention this to the police out of respect for her family, but she felt he needed to know the whole truth. She cast a sorrowful glance in my direction. I kept my eyes locked on the television, letting my jaw hang slightly slack, playing the oblivious old fool. Vanessa let out a tragic sigh and whispered that my financial situation had become dangerously unstable over the last year. She wove a masterpiece of fiction right in my living room. She completely fabricated a story about me developing a severe underground gambling addiction after my wife passed away. She described secret late-night phone calls, men in dark cars parking outside our house, and my supposed desperate pleas for cash. She told the investigator that I had blown through my entire pension and was heavily in debt to some very dangerous men. The audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was taking the exact criminal profile of her own mortgage fraud syndicate and projecting it directly onto me. She told Mr. Reed that Cameron had been under immense stress trying to pay off my illicit debts to protect our family name. She suggested that perhaps the car crash was not an accident at all. She planted the poisonous seed that maybe my supposed gambling creditors had tampered with Cameron's vehicle as a violent warning. She was giving the insurance company a perfect alternate theory for the suspicious fire. If the investigator believed her, the insurance company would focus their resources on investigating my non-existent gambling debts instead of looking into her fraudulent real estate startup. It was a brilliant and utterly evil deflection. But she did not stop there. She needed the $5 million released immediately before the syndicate bosses lost their patience. She leaned closer to Mr. Reed, a single tear sliding down her cheek. She explained that she desperately needed the claim processed as quickly as possible. She claimed that my mental health was deteriorating rapidly due to the guilt and the grief. She pointed a trembling finger at me sitting quietly in the corner. She whispered that I was suffering from severe dementia and that I had wandered off to the airport last night, hallucinating that Cameron was still alive. She told him I was becoming a danger to myself and that she needed the insurance money to pay for a secure residential psychiatric facility for me. She was using my fake mental decline not just to steal my house, but to emotionally blackmail a federal investigator into rushing a massive payout. She sobbed quietly, telling him that she was a pregnant widow drowning in her father-in-law's debts, and that she just wanted to lay her husband to rest and move on. Mr. Reed stopped writing. He looked up from his notepad and stared at me. I could feel his sharp analytical eyes scanning my face, my posture, my faded clothes. I knew I had to sell the performance of a lifetime. I slowly turned my head toward them, blinking in confusion. I looked directly at the investigator and asked him in a weak, trembling voice if he was the man who came to fix the radiator. I smiled a vacant, hollow smile and told him the house was very cold and that Cameron would be home from school soon. Mr. Reed's expression softened into a look of profound pity. He looked back at Vanessa and nodded slowly, murmuring his condolences for the heavy burden she was carrying. He closed his folder and put his pen away. Vanessa let out a shaky breath of relief. She thought she had completely manipulated him. She thought she had effectively framed me for the suspicious circumstances of the crash and secured her multi-million-dollar payout. I slowly pushed myself up from the armchair. I made sure my knees popped and my hands trembled just enough to look authentic. I shuffled across the thick living room rug, dragging my left foot slightly. I let my eyes wander aimlessly across the walls, as if the house I had lived in for 40 years was suddenly a strange and frightening place. I walked over to the cardboard boxes Vanessa had been filling with my late wife's porcelain teacups. I reached down with a shaking hand and picked up a delicate floral saucer. I held it close to my face, squinting at it, as if trying to decipher an ancient language. I turned to the empty corner of the room and spoke in a soft, breathless whisper. I said, "Diane, we need to buy more sugar before the storm hits." I asked the empty wall if she had seen my work boots, because the foreman was going to yell at me if I was late for the bridge pouring. I let my voice crack on the last word. I stood there waiting for the reaction. I heard Vanessa let out a long, trembling sigh. She stood up from the sofa and walked over to me, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. She softly took the porcelain saucer from my fingers and placed it back into the box. She looked over her shoulder at Mr. Reed with a face full of manufactured agony. She whispered to him that this is what she deals with every single hour of the day. She told him that my mind was completely trapped in the past and that I was completely incapable of understanding that my son was gone. I looked down at my hands and started rubbing my thumbs together, playing the part of the anxious, confused elder. I let a small whimper escape my throat. Mr. Reed stood up from his chair. I could hear the heavy rustle of his suit jacket. He walked over to us, his professional demeanor cracking just a little under the weight of the tragic scene. He told Vanessa that he was deeply sorry for her dual burden. He said it must be incredibly difficult to mourn a husband while becoming the sole caretaker for a father-in-law who had lost his grip on reality. Vanessa wiped a non-existent tear from her eye and nodded bravely. She said she was just trying to do what Cameron would have wanted. She told the investigator that she just needed the financial resources to make sure I was put in a safe facility where I could not hurt myself or wander out into the freezing rain again. The trap was working perfectly. My performance was giving her exactly what she wanted. I was handing her the shovel she was using to dig her own grave. She was so blinded by her own arrogance that she could not see she was being played. She felt absolute, total control of the room. She believed she had effectively neutralized the insurance company's suspicions and secured the $5 million payout, all by using my fake illness as a shield. I continued to stare blankly at the floor, shuffling my feet and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I knew Mr. Reed was about to leave. He had seen enough to justify expediting the claim. I had to make my move before he walked out the front door. Mr. Reed closed his leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. He told Vanessa he had everything he needed for now, He promised to personally expedite the file with the regional director and see what he could do to release the funds by the end of the week. Vanessa clasped her hands to her chest, murmuring her profound gratitude. She offered to walk him to his car, but he politely declined. He put on his heavy winter coat and turned toward the front door. This was my window. I turned away from the boxes and started walking toward the hallway. I timed my steps perfectly. Just as Mr. Reed stepped into the narrow entryway, I intentionally tripped over the edge of the hall runner. I let out a startled gasp and threw my hands forward. I crashed directly into the insurance investigator. He grunted in surprise and instinctively reached out to catch me before I hit the hardwood floor. His strong hands grabbed my shoulders, stabilizing my weight. Vanessa gasped from the living room and hurried over, apologizing profusely for my clumsiness. But in the 3 seconds it took her to reach us, I had already completed the transfer. When I threw my hands forward, I pressed my right palm flat against Mr. Reed's chest, directly over the breast pocket of his winter coat. Tucked neatly between my fingers was the stiff white business card belonging to Bradley Foster. On the back of the card I had written a very clear message in dark ink. The note read, "Do not approve the payout check, the offshore accounts of the real estate startup, she is poisoning him." I slid the card smoothly down into his deep pocket. As I pulled back to steady myself, I looked directly up into Mr. Reed's eyes. I dropped the vacant, confused stare entirely. For one single, terrifying second, I let him see the sharp, calculating engineer hiding behind the mask of dementia. I gave him a look of absolute burning clarity. I gave a microscopic nod toward his pocket. I saw the flash of confusion and then sudden, sharp comprehension register in his eyes. He felt the card slip into his pocket. He saw the truth in my face. Then Vanessa was there, pulling me away by the arm, scolding me gently for not watching where I was going. I instantly reverted to the trembling old man looking down at the floor and muttering apologies. Mr. Reed stood perfectly still for a moment. He looked at Vanessa, and then he looked at me. He smoothed his coat over his chest right where the card was hidden. He cleared his throat and told Vanessa not to worry about it. He said he would be in touch very soon. He turned and walked out the front door, stepping into the cold morning air. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. Vanessa let go of my arm and let out a loud, triumphant laugh. She walked back into the living room victorious. She had no idea that I had just handed a federal investigator the map to her complete destruction. Barely 10 minutes after the insurance investigator drove away from my curb, the atmosphere inside my home shifted violently. The theater of grief was officially closed. Vanessa walked over to the front window and yanked the heavy curtains shut, blocking out the morning light. She did not say a word to me. She simply paced across the living room floor, checking her expensive watch. The doorbell rang again. It was a sharp, impatient sound. Vanessa quickly unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. A man walked into my entryway. He did not look like any legal professional I had ever met. He was a heavy-set man wearing a poorly tailored gray suit that smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. He carried a battered leather briefcase under his arm. He did not introduce himself to me. He did not offer his hand. He simply gave Vanessa a curt nod and walked directly into my living room. He sat down heavily on my sofa, sinking into the cushions, and placed his briefcase on my coffee table. He popped the brass latches and pulled out a heavy metal notary stamp. Vanessa walked into the kitchen and retrieved the quitclaim deed from the marble island. She marched back into the living room and slammed the thick stack of papers onto the table right next to his stamp. A legitimate notary public is required by strict state law to verify the identity of the signer and assess their basic mental capacity before authorizing any property transfer. This man did absolutely none of that. He did not ask for my identification. He did not ask if I understood what I was signing. He simply pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and clicked it open. He was completely corrupt and clearly operating on her syndicate payroll. Vanessa stood over my armchair. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. She told me the waiting game was finally over. She stated that the insurance investigator took the bait completely and the massive payout was practically already in her bank account. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger at the legal document on the table. She demanded I sign the property transfer right now. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap. I looked up at the stranger on my sofa and then back at Vanessa. I widened my eyes and forced my chin to quiver. I asked her in a high, thin voice who this frightening man was and why he was sitting in my living room. I begged her to call Cameron so he could come home and explain all of this to me. The corrupt notary let out a dry, rattling laugh that sounded like loose gravel. Vanessa did not laugh at all. Her face twisted into a mask of pure malice. She leaned down so close I could feel the angry heat of her breath against my cheek. She told me to drop the pathetic, senile act immediately. Or maybe she whispered the act was completely real. Maybe my brain was finally rotting away into useless mush, just like she always hoped it would. Either way, she hissed. It worked perfectly on the federal agent, and it was going to work perfectly for her next move. The notary tapped his silver pen against the glass table. The sharp, repetitive sound was like a hammer striking a nail in the tense room. He told me to just sign the paper so he could get his cut and get out of this depressing house. He slid the document closer to my trembling hands. I looked down at the signature line. The paper demanded the total unconditional surrender of the only shelter I had left in the entire world. I hesitated, letting my hands hover nervously over the silver pen. I let out a soft, pathetic whimper. I told her I did not want to lose my home. I told her I built this house with my own 2 hands, and I wanted to die in my own bed. Vanessa completely lost whatever thin shred of patience she had left. She uncoiled her ultimate threat with terrifying precision. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her cell phone, and tapped the screen fiercely. She shoved the glowing screen directly into my face. It was a digital brochure for a state-run psychiatric hospital located 3 counties away. She told me I had exactly 2 choices, and she did not care which one I picked. Option 1, she explained, was to sign the deed immediately. She promised that if I gave her the house without a fight, she would place me in a moderately decent assisted living facility. She said she would generously pay the monthly fees for the first 6 months, and after that I would be entirely on my own to figure out my survival. Option 2 was a promise of absolute destruction. She told me that if I refused to pick up that pen, she would make a single phone call. She reminded me that she now had the insurance investigator as a credible official witness to my supposed mental collapse. She said she had her corrupt syndicate doctor on standby, ready to sign emergency involuntary commitment papers by noon. She described the state psychiatric ward in brutal, horrifying detail. She told me it was a miserable, underfunded concrete box filled with violent, unstable patients and abusive orderlies who did not care if the inmates lived or died. She promised she would lock me in that specific ward and throw away the key. She said I would spend the rest of my miserable life heavily medicated into a drooling stupor, staring blankly at a peeling plaster wall until my heart finally gave out. She leaned even closer, her eyes completely devoid of any human empathy. She whispered that she would legally take the house away from me anyway, through a court-ordered guardianship petition, but sending me to the asylum would be far more satisfying for her. She told me I was absolutely nothing. She called me a pathetic, weak old man who had completely outlived his usefulness to the world. Then she delivered the final, crushing blow. She said Cameron was a weak, pathetic coward just like me, and that is exactly why he ended up screaming in a burning car. That comment was the ultimate cruelty. She was intentionally weaponizing the horrific supposed death of my only son, simply to break my spirit and force my compliance. She wanted to completely obliterate my will to fight back. I looked up at her twisted, hateful face. The urge to drop the dementia act and reveal everything was absolutely overwhelming. I wanted to stand up, grab her by the shoulders, and scream that I owned her entire pathetic life. I wanted to tell her she was blindly walking into a federal prison cell. but I forced the calculating engineer to stay buried deep inside my mind. The flawless execution of the trap required her to commit this specific felony. She had to take the bait completely and irrevocably. I let out a broken, agonizing wail. I covered my face with both of my hands and began to openly weep. I sobbed loudly, telling her she was a monster. I begged her not to lock me away in the dark concrete hospital. Vanessa smiled. It was a cold, terrifyingly victorious smile. She picked up the silver pen and shoved it violently into my shaking hand. She ordered me to sign the paper and stop whining like a child. I lowered my head in total absolute submission. I pressed the pen tip to the thick legal paper. My hand trembled violently as I slowly traced my signature onto the blank line. I intentionally made the letters shaky, weak, and barely legible, exactly like a terrified elderly man losing his motor skills would write. The corrupt notary immediately snatched the document away from me. He did not even bother to look at my face or check my work. He simply slammed his heavy brass stamp onto the paper, leaving a dark, permanent state seal. He hastily scribbled his own illegible signature next to mine, authenticating the massive fraud. He handed the finalized paper directly to Vanessa. She snatched it from his hands, holding it up to the light, like a priceless hunting trophy. Her eyes were wide with greedy, manic triumph. She told the notary to get out of her house. He shoved his stamp back into his briefcase and practically ran out the front door. Vanessa stood alone in the center of my living room, holding the forged quitclaim deed to my property. She looked around at the painted walls, the antique furniture, and the entire life I had built. She told me to start packing a very small bag. She said her syndicate movers were arriving first thing tomorrow morning and that I would be out of her new house by noon. She turned on her heel and walked out the front door, leaving me completely alone in the silent room. She was absolutely certain she had crushed me into dust. She had no idea she had just handed me the final undeniable piece of criminal evidence I needed to destroy her forever. I let my knees buckle under the crushing weight of her threat. I collapsed onto the thick living room rug right at Vanessa's feet. I reached out with trembling hands and grasped the hem of her black morning coat. I looked up at her with tears streaming down my wrinkled face. I begged her to show me just a fraction of mercy. I pleaded with her to remember the day she married my son. I reminded her of the money I had freely given to fund her dreams and the love I had shown her when she joined our family. I sobbed openly, letting the tears fall freely, playing the role of a completely shattered man whose entire universe had just collapsed. I told her I would do anything she wanted if she would just let me stay in the house where my late wife had taken her final breath. The corrupt notary shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, checking his watch and muttering under his breath, but Vanessa did not flinch. She looked down at me with eyes as cold and dead as a winter grave. She violently kicked her leg back, pulling her coat out of my desperate grip. She told me my tears were pathetic. She said my money was gone and my son was dead, and nobody in the entire world cared about what I wanted anymore. She grabbed the silver pen off the glass table and shoved it so hard into my palm that the cold metal bruised my skin. She screamed at me to sign the deed immediately or she would dial the psychiatric hospital that very second. I stayed on my knees, bowing my head in absolute surrender. I let out a loud, agonizing wail that echoed off the high ceilings of the house I had built. I dragged my heavy body up from the floor, leaning all of my weight against the edge of the glass coffee table. I picked up the legal document with both hands, letting the paper rattle loudly in my violently shaking grasp. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing out a fresh wave of bitter tears. I let a few heavy drops fall directly onto the signature line, smudging the black ink of the printed text. I wanted this specific performance to be physically recorded on the document itself. I slowly leaned over the table. I pressed the silver pen to the thick paper. I dragged the metal tip across the line, forcing my muscles to twitch and jerk. I wrote my name with the sloppy, disjointed handwriting of a terrified and broken elder losing his motor skills. The entire time my heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic precision. I was not a victim being dragged to the slaughter. I was the architect installing the final lock on a prison door. The notary snatched the tear-stained paper the exact second I lifted the pen. He slammed his heavy brass stamp onto the bottom corner, authenticating the transfer of $1 million estate without a single shred of legal protocol. He packed his briefcase and hurried out the front door, leaving the smell of stale smoke behind. Vanessa snatched the stamped deed off the table. She held the thick paper up to the light of the living room chandelier. Her face was completely transformed. The mask of the grieving widow was entirely gone, replaced by a terrifying manic greed. She traced her manicured finger over my shaky signature, letting out a loud, triumphant laugh. She looked down at me, still slumped against the coffee table, and told me I had finally done something useful with my pathetic life. She did not even bother to pretend she was going to help me find an assisted living facility now that she had what she wanted. She told me I had exactly 24 hours to pack my miserable belongings into a single suitcase and get off her property. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number, immediately putting it on speakerphone. I could hear the deep voice of one of her syndicate partners answer. Vanessa practically shouted into the receiver, boasting that she had the signed deed in her hand. She bragged about how easily she had broken my mind and forced me to surrender the estate. She told the man on the phone they could list the property for sale tomorrow morning and use the cash to pay off their angry private lenders. She walked out of my house without looking back, slamming the heavy front door so hard the windows rattled in their frames. I stayed slumped against the coffee table for exactly 10 seconds, listening to the roar of her luxury vehicle speeding away from my curb. Then the shaking in my hands stopped completely. The tears dried on my face. I stood up tall, rolling my shoulders back to relieve the tension of the physical performance. I walked calmly into my kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. I drank it slowly, enjoying the absolute silence of my home. Vanessa was currently driving down the highway, believing she had just secured a massive real estate fortune. She believed she had outsmarted the federal investigators, outrun her dangerous creditors, and completely destroyed her father-in-law. She was completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. But the piece of paper sitting on the passenger seat of her car was completely worthless. It was nothing more than a heavily stained piece of trash. 3 days ago, in a high-rise office downtown, I had legally transferred the absolute ownership of this house into an impenetrable, irrevocable living trust. I did not own the property, she just forced me to sign away. By forcing a supposedly senile man to sign a voided quitclaim deed under the threat of psychiatric imprisonment, using a corrupt notary on her payroll, Vanessa had not secured her financial freedom. She had just formally documented a massive, undeniable federal crime. She had just handed the authorities the exact piece of physical evidence they needed to prove her criminal intent. I picked up my cell phone from the marble counter and dialed Bradley Foster. He answered on the first ring. I told him in a clear, steady voice that she took the bait and that we had the forged signature. Bradley let out a low, satisfied chuckle. He told me to lock my doors and get a good night of sleep, because tomorrow the sky was going to fall directly on her head. The Oakmont Country Club was a fortress of old money and newly minted arrogance. Vanessa had rented the grand ballroom for what the embossed invitations called a memorial fundraiser in honor of my deceased son. In reality, the gathering was nothing more than a lavish victory lap. I stood alone in the shadowed vestibule, looking through the heavy glass double doors into the brightly lit room. There was absolutely no sorrow present in that massive ballroom. The syndicate had gathered to celebrate their impending $5 million payday. A string quartet played upbeat classical music in the corner, completely ignoring the supposed somber nature of the event. Men in tailored silk suits and women draped in designer evening gowns stood in tight, intimate circles, laughing loudly and clinking crystal flutes of imported champagne. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of caviar and expensive appetizers. These were the predators who had funded the fake real estate empire. These were the ruthless individuals who believed my son was nothing more than a convenient pile of ashes scattered on a lonely stretch of highway. Vanessa was standing near the center of the room, holding court like a reigning queen. She had completely abandoned her black mourning attire for a stunning, dark emerald evening gown that caught the chandelier light with every movement. She looked radiant and energized, completely untouched by the horrific crimes she had committed over the past 48 hours. She was holding a glass of champagne, smiling brightly, as a heavy-set man with a thick gold watch patted her on the shoulder. I knew exactly who these people were, because Bradley had meticulously detailed their profiles in his legal files. They were predatory loan sharks, white-collar criminals, and corrupt mortgage brokers. They were openly celebrating the fact that the insurance investigator had bought her lies and expedited the massive claim. They firmly believed the money was already flowing through the digital pipelines into their offshore bank accounts. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance permeating the room was physically suffocating. They felt completely invincible tonight. They believed they had successfully murdered an innocent man, outsmarted the federal authorities, and ruthlessly robbed a retired engineer of his entire life savings. They were drinking expensive wine paid for by the blood of my family. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, calculated anger settle into a hard knot in my stomach. I checked the breast pocket of my faded jacket, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of the digital voice recorder. The trap was fully loaded. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor as I walked past the grand ice sculpture in the foyer. The cold air radiating from the carved swan felt exactly like the atmosphere of the room. All I needed to do was walk straight into the lion den and hand them the rope. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped onto the plush carpet of the ballroom. My entrance into the ballroom did not go unnoticed by the crowd. The loud, joyful chatter near the front doors immediately died down, replaced by uncomfortable, forced murmurs. I had intentionally dressed for the tragic part she wrote for me. I wore a faded brown suit that was at least 15 years out of date. The jacket hung loosely on my tired shoulders, and the fabric was deeply wrinkled from sitting in the back of my closet. I hunched my back slightly, dragged my feet, and looked completely lost in the opulent surroundings. Vanessa spotted me almost instantly through the crowd. The bright, victorious smile on her face vanished for a mere fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of genuine annoyance. But she recovered with terrifying speed, slipping right back into her masterful performance of the grieving but strong widow. She handed her champagne flute to a passing waiter and glided across the polished ballroom floor toward me with her arms outstretched. She embraced me loosely, making absolutely sure not to wrinkle her expensive silk dress against my old clothes. She turned back to the crowd, projecting her voice so that every single syndicate member could hear her words. She sighed loudly and told the entire room how incredibly brave I was for trying to attend. She wrapped her arm tightly around my shoulder, holding me firmly in place like a captive circus animal. She asked the guests for their attention, gently tapping a silver spoon against a crystal water glass. The room fell entirely silent, the string quartet immediately stopping their cheerful music. Vanessa put on a face of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. She announced to the gathering of wealthy criminals that this had been the most tragic week of our lives. She said the loss of Cameron had completely broken the foundation of our family. Then she looked down at me with a sickening expression of manufactured pity. She told the crowd that the immense grief had simply been too much for my fragile, aging mind to bear. She stroked my shoulder and announced that my cognitive decline had accelerated drastically over the last few days. She lied flawlessly, stating that I was suffering from severe night terrors, hallucinations, and dangerous paranoia. I kept my head down, staring at the expensive, polished shoes of the men standing nearby, playing the part of the confused, helpless elder perfectly. I let my hands shake visibly at my sides, letting out a small, confused sigh. Vanessa raised her voice slightly, ensuring everyone in the back of the room heard her next devastating words. She said that because of my dangerous mental state, she had been forced to make a very difficult and legally binding decision. She announced that tomorrow morning I would be permanently moving out of my home and transferring into a highly specialized residential psychiatric care facility. She used the gentle term specialized care, but the syndicate members in the room knew exactly what she meant. They knew she was legally locking me in a state asylum to seize my estate without a fight. A low murmur of fake sympathy rippled through the wealthy crowd. Several women touched their diamond necklaces and shook their heads, whispering about how tragic the situation was. Vanessa wiped a completely dry eye and told them that she was taking full control of my finances to ensure I received the best medical attention possible. It was a public execution of my character. She was parading my supposed insanity in front of her criminal partners to prove she had brutally tied up all the loose ends. She gave me a condescending pat on the cheek and told me to go sit at a quiet table in the corner where the noise would not frighten me. I shuffled over to the small round table in the far corner of the ballroom, just as she had publicly instructed me to do. The table was tucked behind a massive potted fern, draped in heavy shadows, far away from the center of the celebration. I slumped into the padded chair, staring blankly at the crisp, white linen tablecloth. Two heavy-set men and a woman wearing a sharp red cocktail dress were standing just a few feet away from my chair. They held crystal glasses filled with amber liquor leaning against a tall cocktail table. They glanced in my direction for a fraction of a second, but quickly dismissed me. To them, I was just a broken piece of furniture, a senile old man waiting to be shipped off to a state asylum. Because they firmly believed my mind was completely gone, they did not even bother to lower their voices. I sat perfectly still, keeping my breathing slow and shallow, listening to every single word they said. The woman in the red dress took a sip of her expensive drink and laughed softly. She told the men that she could not believe Vanessa actually pulled the whole thing off without a single hitch. She said the federal insurance investigators were usually much harder to fool, especially with a $5 million payout on the line. One of the men, a mortgage broker with a slicked-back haircut, chuckled deeply. He said the car fire was a stroke of genius, but the real masterpiece was exactly how she handled the old man. He pointed his glass discreetly in my direction, not caring if I saw the gesture. He told the group that Vanessa had bragged to them earlier about the confrontation in my kitchen. He said he was absolutely amazed that I signed over $1 million estate without putting up a fight or demanding a lawyer. The other man laughed, shaking his head in pure amusement. He said it was not the threat of the psychiatric hospital that finally broke me. He said it was the baby. The woman in the red dress smiled a cruel, sharp smile. She said playing the pregnant widow card was the most brilliant move Vanessa had ever made in her entire life. She told the men that Vanessa was not pregnant at all. She said Vanessa had completely fabricated the story of the unborn child just to twist the knife into my grieving heart and force my signature. She explained that Vanessa knew I was desperate for a grandchild and that I would surrender absolutely anything to protect my son's legacy. The men laughed again, raising their glasses in a toast to her pure, unadulterated ruthlessness. They called her a cold-blooded visionary. I sat in my chair staring at the white tablecloth. My hands rested flat against my thighs. I did not tremble. I did not cry. The last remaining shred of human empathy I held for that woman evaporated completely. She had weaponized the imaginary life of a grandchild to steal the home where I raised my real child. She had used my deepest vulnerabilities as a cheap negotiating tactic. I felt a profound, settling coldness spread through my veins. The engineer in me analyzed the new data with absolute emotional detachment. There were no innocent bystanders left to protect. There was no unborn child to consider. There was only a room full of predators who desperately needed to be taught a permanent lesson about truth and consequences. The string quartet suddenly stopped playing their cheerful music. A sharp feedback whine echoed from the massive speakers positioned around the perimeter of the ballroom. Vanessa had walked up to the small elevated stage at the front of the room. She stood behind a sleek acrylic podium, tapping her manicured fingernail against the silver microphone. The entire room fell silent. The syndicate members turned their attention toward their victorious leader. Vanessa smiled brightly, raising her crystal champagne flute high into the air. She welcomed everyone to the gathering, thanking them for their unwavering support during her supposed time of tragic loss. She began to speak eloquently about the future. She announced that with the upcoming influx of capital from the insurance claim, they were going to launch a massive new real estate investment fund. She spoke about rapid expansion, acquiring new commercial properties, and dominating the city housing market. The crowd hung on her every word, completely mesmerized by the promise of endless wealth. No one was looking at the dark corner of the ballroom. No one was looking at the broken old man sitting behind the potted fern. I slowly pushed my chair back from the table. I stood up, my movements smooth and completely devoid of the physical hesitation I had faked earlier. I slipped into the narrow service hallway that ran behind the decorative drapes lining the ballroom walls. I walked purposefully down the dark corridor, guided by the faint glow of the red exit signs. I reached the audio-visual control booth located at the back of the room. The booth was a small, elevated platform enclosed by tinted glass housing the massive soundboard that controlled the ballroom speakers. The young technician hired for the event had stepped outside for a smoke break, leaving the heavy door slightly ajar. I slipped inside the dark booth. Through the tinted glass, I had a perfect panoramic view of Vanessa, standing on the stage, bathing in the bright spotlight, her face glowing with absolute arrogance. I reached into the breast pocket of my faded suit jacket and pulled out the heavy black digital voice recorder. I looked down at the complex soundboard illuminated by hundreds of tiny glowing lights. I had spent 40 years designing complex structural systems. Reading a basic audio mixing console was incredibly simple for me. I found the auxiliary input jack located right next to the main master volume slider. I pulled a small connecting cable from the technician's spare parts bin resting on the desk. I plugged one end firmly into the digital recorder and the other end directly into the sound system. I pushed the master volume slider all the way up to its maximum capacity, ensuring the sound would be deafening. Vanessa was just finishing her grand speech. She raised her glass one final time, preparing to offer a toast to the memory of my son. She told the wealthy crowd that Cameron would have wanted them to be wildly successful. I placed my thumb firmly over the play button on the digital recorder. I looked through the tinted glass, watching her sickening smile. I pressed down on the button. Vanessa stood at the sleek acrylic podium, looking out over the sea of wealthy criminals. She adjusted the microphone with a perfectly manicured hand and offered the crowd a fragile, trembling smile. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She began by speaking about Cameron using words like visionary and dedicated. She painted a completely fictitious picture of a loving husband who worked tirelessly to provide for his family. She claimed Cameron spent his final days drawing up blueprints for community centers and affordable housing. She knew every single person in that room was involved in predatory lending, but she wrapped their toxic greed in the beautiful language of philanthropy. She told the room that the tragic car fire had taken away her soulmate, but it had also given her a profound clarity about the future. She spoke about the fragility of life and the importance of leaving a lasting legacy. Her voice cracked perfectly on cue, drawing sympathetic murmurs from the audience. Then, with the smooth, calculated grace of a seasoned con artist, she pivoted the narrative. She wiped away a fake tear and transitioned directly from mourning her husband to pitching her next massive financial scam. She announced that to honor his memory, she was officially launching the Vanguard Real Estate Investment Fund. She told the eager crowd that thanks to a sudden and substantial influx of capital, they were perfectly positioned to aggressively acquire commercial properties across the state. She did not mention that the sudden capital was a fraudulent $5 million life insurance payout secured by her own attempted murder. She simply promised them unprecedented returns on their investments. The men in expensive suits nodded in greedy approval, already calculating their illegal profits. The women smiled, raising their glasses in silent agreement. Vanessa was completely intoxicated by her own power. She felt invincible standing under the bright spotlight, believing she had successfully buried every single one of her sins along with my son. She picked up her crystal champagne flute from the podium and raised it high into the air. She projected her voice across the silent ballroom, asking everyone to raise a glass to the future, to prosperity, and to the eternal memory of her beloved husband. It was the most sickeningly sweet display of hypocrisy I had ever witnessed in my entire 70 years of life. She stood there basking in the adulation of her criminal peers, entirely unaware that the man she thought she had broken into a million pieces was standing in the dark control booth right behind her. I stood in the shadows of the audio-visual booth, looking through the tinted glass. I watched her raise that crystal flute, and I pressed my thumb down hard on the play button of the digital voice recorder. I did not just play the audio. I had pushed the master volume slider on the mixing console to its absolute maximum limit. A sharp crackle of static erupted from the massive speakers mounted high on the ballroom walls, instantly shattering the elegant silence. The sudden abrasive noise made several guests jump, spilling their expensive champagne onto their tailored suits. Vanessa froze on the stage, her glass still raised, her perfect smile faltering as she looked around in confusion. Then the booming, panicked voice of my son filled the enormous room. Cameron sounded terrified, frantic, and completely out of breath. His voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floors. He started by begging me for forgiveness. He said he had to disappear because his wife was actively trying to murder him. The entire ballroom seemed to instantly stop breathing. The syndicate members, who had been smiling just a second ago, now stood perfectly rigid, their faces draining of color. Cameron's voice continued, relentlessly exposing every single dark secret they thought was securely hidden. He confessed that the real estate startup was never a legitimate business, but a massive illegal mortgage fraud ring. He detailed exactly how they were forging property deeds, taking out fraudulent bridge loans, and funneling the stolen cash into offshore accounts. The heavy-set men, who had laughed at me earlier, now looked around the room with wild, panicked eyes, realizing their federal crimes were being broadcasted at maximum volume. But the audio recording did not stop at financial fraud. Cameron's terrified voice laid out the exact methodology of his attempted murder. He told the silent, horrified room that Vanessa had secretly taken out a $5 million life insurance policy, forging his signature on the medical documents. He explained how she had been quietly slipping small doses of toxic antifreeze into his morning coffee to trigger a fatal heart attack before the federal auditors arrived. He said he had found the empty vials hidden in their garage and realized he had to fake his own fiery death just to escape her. Vanessa stood completely paralyzed behind the acrylic podium. The crystal flute slipped from her numb fingers and shattered violently against the hard wooden stage. The sound of breaking glass snapped the trance of the room, but nobody moved to help her. Her beautiful emerald gown suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The mask of the grieving, powerful widow dissolved completely, revealing the terrified, desperate criminal hiding underneath. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for the source of the audio. But the sound was coming from everywhere at once, trapping her in her own confessed nightmares. The wealthy predators who had been celebrating with her just moments ago immediately began stepping backward, physically distancing themselves from the stage. They were ruthless criminals, but they were not fools. They knew a federal confession when they heard one, and they wanted absolutely no part of an attempted murder investigation. Vanessa opened her mouth trying to speak, trying to form a lie or a denial, but absolutely no sound came out. She gripped the edges of the podium so hard her knuckles turned stark white. She was completely exposed, stripped of her power, her money, and her fake dignity in front of the very people she sought to impress. The recording finally clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The trap had sprung flawlessly, completely obliterating her world. The echo of the recording faded into a terrifying silence, but that silence only lasted for a single heartbeat. Then the absolute devastation washed over the room like a tidal wave. The elegant veneer of the memorial fundraiser shattered instantly. The heavy-set mortgage broker with the slicked-back haircut was the first to react. The crystal glass slipped right through his fingers and shattered violently against the polished marble floor. He did not even look down at the mess. His face had turned a sickening shade of pale gray. He grabbed his tailored suit jacket off the back of a chair and started shoving his way through the crowd, heading straight for the main exit. His sudden movement broke the spell, paralyzing the rest of the room. Absolute chaos erupted within the grand ballroom. The string quartet musicians scrambled out of their chairs, knocking over their expensive wooden music stands in a desperate rush to escape through the kitchen service doors. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the federal murder conspiracy. The woman in the sharp red cocktail dress who had been laughing at me just minutes ago was now hyperventilating. She stumbled backward, completely losing her balance in her high heels, and crashed into a cocktail table, sending a dozen expensive champagne flutes crashing to the ground. The sound of breaking glass echoed everywhere, joining the rising chorus of panicked shouts and angry curses. These were arrogant white-collar criminals who operated entirely in the shadows. They relied on forged paperwork and quiet intimidation to steal their millions. They were completely unprepared for a public, brutal exposure. The realization that they were all standing in a room listening to a dead man confess to a massive federal fraud scheme involving their specific holding companies sent them into pure survival mode. They began pushing and shoving each other, abandoning all their refined manners. Men in expensive silk suits practically trampled over each other, trying to reach the vestibule. Women abandoned their designer clutch purses on the tables, hiking up their elegant evening gowns so they could run faster. They were like rats fleeing a sinking ship, completely turning on one another in their desperation to avoid the inevitable federal indictments. Up on the stage, the transformation of Vanessa was absolute and pathetic. The glowing, confident queen of the real estate empire had been completely obliterated. She stood frozen behind the acrylic podium, watching her entire criminal network dissolve into a stampeding mob. Her mouth opened and closed, but she could not draw enough breath to speak. Her perfect posture collapsed her shoulders, hunching forward, as if she were trying to physically shrink away from the invisible accusations raining down on her. She reached out with a trembling hand, grasping the edge of the microphone stand, trying to steady her shaking legs. She looked out at the frantic faces of the syndicate bosses she had worked so hard to impress. She saw the pure hatred and fear directed right back at her. They knew she was the center of this catastrophic failure. They knew her greed had drawn the federal spotlight directly onto their illicit operations. She had promised them millions, and instead she had served them a guaranteed prison sentence on a silver platter. The sheer magnitude of her failure crushed her. The mask of the grieving strong widow completely fell away, revealing the terrified, cowardly extortionist underneath. She stumbled backward away from the podium, her expensive emerald gown catching on the sharp edge of the broken champagne flute she had dropped. She tore the silk fabric, but she did not even notice. She was watching her entire life burn to the ground in real time, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop the flames. The panicked stampede grew louder as guests bottlenecked near the grand entrance, pushing violently against the heavy mahogany doors. Waiters dropped their silver trays of caviar, running for the emergency exits in the back. The lavish celebration of their impending fortune had officially become the terrifying loud graveyard of their criminal ambition. Every single lie she had, meticulously built over the past 3 years, was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. Vanessa finally found her voice. She lunged forward, grabbing the silver microphone with both hands. She screamed over the deafening noise of the fleeing crowd, demanding they stop running. Her voice was shrill, hysterical, and completely stripped of its usual smooth charm. She shrieked that they were all acting like fools. She pointed wildly toward the audio-visual booth in the back of the room, blaming everything on me. She shouted that the recording was an absolute fake. She told the panicked syndicate members that I was a bitter, senile old man who had hired someone to make an artificial intelligence deepfake. She desperately tried to spin a new web of lies, claiming I used computer software to mimic my dead son voice because I was furious about losing my house. She begged the loan sharks and the mortgage brokers to listen to reason. She swore on her life that she never poisoned anyone and that the federal investigators had already cleared her of any wrongdoing. She promised them the $5 million payout was still secure and that the real estate fund was moving forward exactly as planned. But her words were completely useless. The crowd did not care about her desperate promises. They only cared about saving their own skin. The heavy-set man who had praised her earlier stopped near the exit and looked back at her with absolute disgust. He shouted that she was a complete liability and that she was entirely on her own. He turned his back on her and shoved the grand doors open. Vanessa realized she was losing everything. She abandoned the podium and ran down the stage steps, practically tripping over her torn silk dress. She chased after the fleeing guests, reaching out to grab their arms, begging them not to abandon her. She screamed that they were in this together and that they needed to help her silence me. She was utterly unhinged, a desperate criminal clutching at the fading remnants of her stolen power. Then a heavy metallic sound echoed through the grand vestibule. The panicked guests who had rushed into the lobby suddenly stopped moving. The loud, chaotic stampede abruptly turned into a terrified, confused murmur. The massive glass double doors leading out to the country club parking lot had been completely chained shut from the outside. The heavy brass deadbolts on the side exits simultaneously clicked into place, locking the entire syndicate inside the building. The grand ballroom was no longer a lavish celebration hall. It had just become a holding cell. Vanessa crashed into the crowd of trapped guests, pushing her way to the front. She pounded her fists against the locked glass doors, screaming for the valets to open them. She was completely trapped in the disaster of her own making, and the final act was just beginning. She turned back to face the ballroom, her chest heaving as pure terror finally overtook her manic anger. There was absolutely nowhere left for her to run. Vanessa pounded her fists against the heavy glass doors of the grand vestibule, but the thick brass deadbolts held firm. The panicked cries of the trapped syndicate members echoed off the vaulted ceilings, creating a deafening chorus of absolute terror. Then the loud mechanical clank of heavy locks disengaging echoed through the lobby. The massive mahogany doors swung open simultaneously, forcing Vanessa to stumble backward to avoid being hit. The chaotic noise inside the ballroom died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzed silence. Bradley Foster walked slowly into the center of the vestibule. He was no longer the tired attorney sitting in a dark office at 3 a.m. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, his posture radiating absolute authority and lethal calm. He did not look at the frightened guests. He did not even look at Vanessa. He stood like a general surveying a conquered battlefield. Flanking him on his right was Mr. Reed, the insurance investigator. Mr. Reed was not holding a sympathetic notepad anymore. He held a thick stack of federal warrants in his gloved hands. Flanking Bradley on his left were 6 men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their backs. They moved with swift, terrifying precision, stepping past Bradley and immediately fanning out across the exits of the grand ballroom, blocking any chance of escape. The wealthy criminals who had been desperately trying to flee just moments ago now slowly backed away, raising their hands in silent surrender. They knew it was entirely over. They recognized the lethal combination of a federal fraud task force and a ruthless corporate liquidator. Bradley reached into his briefcase and pulled out the legal portfolio containing the assignments of debt. He handed it directly to the lead federal agent. He pointed his finger toward the heavy-set mortgage broker and the woman in the red dress, identifying the key players of the fraudulent syndicate. The agents began moving through the crowd, pulling heavy plastic zip ties from their belts. The sound of plastic tightening around wrists replaced the sound of clinking champagne glasses. Vanessa stood completely frozen near the entrance, staring at the federal agents with wide, unblinking eyes. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She looked at Mr. Reed, hoping to find the sympathetic man she had manipulated in my living room, but the investigator only gave her a look of profound, absolute disgust. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the white business card I had slipped him, and held it up for her to see. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She realized her perfect manipulation had been completely orchestrated by the very men she thought she had outsmarted. She was surrounded, her criminal empire completely collapsing under the weight of federal authority. I stepped out of the dark audio-visual booth and walked slowly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not hunch my shoulders. I stood completely straight, rolling my shoulders back to their full natural height. The faded brown suit I wore no longer looked like the pathetic garments of a broken old man. It looked like the armor of a man who had just won a brutal war. The sea of terrified syndicate members parted in front of me, stepping aside as if I were carrying a loaded weapon. They looked at me with a mixture of shock and absolute dread, finally realizing that the helpless, senile father-in-law they had openly mocked was the exact architect of their total destruction. I walked directly toward the vestibule, where Vanessa was standing, surrounded by federal agents. She turned her head and saw me approaching. Her mouth fell open, her eyes wide with a terrifying new understanding. She watched me walk with steady, purposeful strides, the complete absence of trembling in my hands, and the sharp, focused clarity in my eyes. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from her. I looked down at her torn emerald gown and her shattered posture. When I finally spoke, my voice was not weak or high-pitched. It was deep, cold, and commanding, echoing with the absolute precision of a structural engineer. I told her the performance was officially over. I said, I had absorbed every single insult, every violent threat, and every ounce of her cruelty, and I had used it all to build the concrete cage she was currently standing in. Vanessa shook her head desperately, trying to reject the reality unfolding in front of her. She stammered that I was insane and that she had the signed deed to my house. She told the federal agents that I was a sick man who belonged in a psychiatric ward. I did not raise my voice. I simply let a cold, humorless smile touch the corners of my mouth. I told her the deed she forced me to sign was completely worthless. I explained that 3 days before she brought her corrupt notary into my living room, I had legally transferred the absolute ownership of my estate into an impenetrable, irrevocable trust. I said the only thing she accomplished by forcing my signature was formally documenting a massive federal forgery. I watched the color completely drain from her face as the first pillar of her arrogant plan crumbled to dust. But I was not finished. I told her she crossed a sacred line when she weaponized the fake life of an unborn grandchild just to twist a knife into my grieving heart. I told her that was her fatal mistake. I explained that while she was busy parading me around as a mentally incompetent fool, I was busy buying up the entirety of her illicit corporate debt. I told her I used the $80,000 Cameron left behind to purchase every single promissory note her fake real estate startup owed to the private lenders. I leaned closer, dropping my voice to a terrifying whisper. I told her I was her primary creditor, and I was officially foreclosing on her entire pathetic life. I said I owned her office, I owned her bank accounts, and I owned the absolute ruins of her fraudulent empire. The second pillar of her existence shattered, leaving her with absolutely nothing to stand on. She began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as she finally comprehended the sheer magnitude of my silent adjustment. I told her she made a terrible miscalculation when she decided to view me as an expired asset. She thought my silence was weakness, and my grief was an opportunity for extortion. I told her an engineer knows exactly how much pressure a structure can take before it violently snaps. She pushed me to my absolute limit and assumed I would simply collapse into dust. Instead, I calculated the exact points of her vulnerability, and I orchestrated a complete demolition. I stepped back, giving the federal agents the space they needed to finish their job. I told her Cameron was safe far away from her poisonous reach, and that she would never see him or my money ever again. I told her to enjoy her new secure facility because she was going to be locked in a dark concrete room for a very long time. Vanessa stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She desperately tried to formulate a defense, but there was absolutely nothing left to say. I turned slightly and gestured toward Bradley Foster. He walked over to us, his heavy leather shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. He opened his sleek briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of banking documents, stamped with the bright red seal of the federal government. I looked back at Vanessa and told her that her arrogance was her ultimate undoing. I explained that when she arrogantly assumed my $80,000 withdrawal was the frantic action of a confused old man hiding cash under a mattress, she completely underestimated who she was dealing with. I told her I did not just buy her toxic syndicate debt with that money. I told her I also used Bradley's immense legal network to follow the digital trail of her stolen funds. I spoke slowly, enunciating every single word, so the reality of her situation would sink deep into her bones. I explained that the offshore accounts she set up in the Cayman Islands were not nearly as secure as her criminal partners had promised her. I told her that federal wire fraud leaves a permanent digital footprint, and once Bradley handed my financial leverage over to the authorities, they immediately obtained an international freezing order. I watched her knees buckle slightly as I told her that every single penny she stole from my family, every dollar she extorted from the banks, and every cent she planned to collect from the fraudulent life insurance policy was entirely gone. I told her the accounts were completely drained and the funds had been seized by the federal government pending a massive criminal trial. She was officially completely bankrupt. She let out a high-pitched whining sound, shaking her head violently. She stammered that I could not possibly do this to her because she was family. She actually tried to use that word to shield herself from the consequences of her own horrific actions. The sheer audacity of her statement made my blood run absolutely cold. I stepped even closer to her, invading her physical space and forcing her to look directly into my eyes. I told her she lost the right to use that word the moment she put poison into my son's coffee cup. I told her real family does not forge signatures on life insurance documents, and real family certainly does not try to lock a grieving father in a state psychiatric hospital just to steal his home. I pointed a steady finger at the thick file the lead federal agent was holding. I told her that file contained the original copy of the quitclaim deed she forced me to sign yesterday morning. I reminded her how she gloated when the corrupt notary stamped that piece of paper. I told her that single document was the final nail in her coffin. I explained that because the property was already legally locked inside an irrevocable trust, her attempt to force the transfer constituted multiple federal felonies, including aggravated identity theft, extortion, and wire fraud. I told her the federal agents had already arrested the corrupt notary an hour ago, and he was currently sitting in an interrogation room loudly confessing to every single illegal transaction she ever paid him to authenticate. The final wall of her defense completely crumbled. She looked at the federal agents standing in a circle around her and realized there was absolutely no loophole left to exploit. She had no money to hire a defense attorney. She had no property to use as collateral for bail. She had absolutely no allies left in the entire world because the syndicate members she had invited to her lavish victory party were currently being zip-tied and shoved toward the exit doors. I looked at her completely ruined face and felt a profound sense of closure. I told her I was done talking to her. I told her she was no longer my problem. I turned my back on her entirely. I nodded to the lead federal agent and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the center of her collapsed empire. I walked toward the edge of the vestibule, feeling the heavy burden of the past few days finally lift from my shoulders. I heard the lead federal agent step forward. He did not read her rights immediately. He first handed her a physical copy of the federal indictment. I watched over my shoulder as her trembling hands took the thick packet of paper. It was over 100 pages long, detailing every single fraudulent loan, every poisoned cup of coffee, and every forged signature she had ever created. The sheer physical weight of the document seemed to pull her down toward the floor. She stared blindly at the front page, realizing that she would spend the rest of her natural life in a concrete cell. The lead federal agent stepped directly into her line of sight, completely blocking her view of the grand ballroom. He spoke in a loud, clear voice, reciting the Miranda rights with practiced mechanical efficiency. He grabbed her left arm and pulled it firmly behind her back. Vanessa let out a sudden, piercing shriek as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around her wrists. The sharp, metallic sound echoed through the high ceilings of the country club lobby, signaling the absolute end of her reign. She completely lost whatever tiny shred of composure she had left. She began to violently thrash and kick her expensive designer heels slipping on the polished marble floor. She screamed my name at the top of her lungs, demanding that I stop them. She ordered me to tell the agents it was all a big misunderstanding. She shrieked that she was a wealthy business owner and they had absolutely no right to treat her like a common criminal. The federal agents ignored her completely. Two of them grabbed her firmly by the arms and began frog-marching her toward the heavy glass exit doors. Her beautiful emerald evening gown ripped further as she struggled, dragging against the ground like a filthy, discarded rag. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of her power, her money, and her fake dignity. She kicked the doorframe as they dragged her outside, screaming obscenities and crying tears of pure, terrified rage. The flashing red and blue lights of a dozen federal vehicles illuminated the dark parking lot, casting long, erratic shadows against the pristine white walls of the country club. Frightened valet attendants hid behind their podiums, watching in absolute shock as the elegant party host was dragged out in heavy chains. The agents shoved her roughly into the back of an armored federal transport van. She hit the metal bench hard, but she kept screaming, her voice hoarse and broken. I watched quietly through the glass doors as the heavy steel door of the van slammed shut, cutting off her frantic screams entirely. The powerful engine roared to life, and the heavy vehicle sped away into the cold, dark night, taking her out of my life forever. The remaining federal agents continued to quietly process the rest of the arrested syndicate bosses, clearing the lavish ballroom of its criminal stain. I stood in the quiet vestibule, breathing in the clean, crisp air. The nightmare was finally over. The empire of lies she had built had been completely leveled to the ground, and justice had been served with absolute, flawless precision. 3 months have passed since the flashing red and blue lights faded from the country club parking lot. It is a Tuesday morning, and the sunlight is streaming brightly through the large bay window of my living room. I am sitting in my favorite armchair, holding a hot cup of black coffee. The house is completely silent, but it is no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a prison waiting for the executioner. It is the warm, settling quiet of a sanctuary that has finally been reclaimed. The air in the house feels incredibly clean. The lingering scent of stale cigarette smoke from the corrupt notary and the overwhelming floral perfume Vanessa used to wear are entirely gone. I spent the first few weeks after her arrest slowly unpacking all the cardboard boxes she had aggressively filled with the porcelain teacups belonging to my late wife. I placed every single delicate saucer exactly back where Diane had originally displayed them in the glass china cabinet. The house belongs to me again in every sense of the word. Bradley Foster finalized the paperwork for the irrevocable trust, ensuring that no one will ever be able to threaten my shelter again. Vanessa is currently awaiting trial in a federal detention center. Her expensive lawyers abandoned her the moment they realized her offshore accounts were completely frozen. The massive fraudulent real estate syndicate she built has been completely dismantled by the authorities piece by piece. The private lenders she owed money to are also facing federal indictments thanks to the financial records I handed over to the investigators. I read about the collapse of her empire in the morning newspaper, but I do not feel any sense of malicious joy. I only feel a profound sense of relief. As a structural engineer, I spent my entire career understanding the invisible forces that hold a building together or tear it apart. I know that if you leave a rotten wooden beam inside a foundation, the entire house will eventually collapse into dust. Vanessa was the rot infecting the foundation of my family. I had to expose her to the harsh light of truth to save what was left of my world. Now the diseased wood has been completely removed. The load-bearing walls of my life are strong and secure once again. I take a sip of my coffee, enjoying the simple freedom of sitting in my own home without looking over my shoulder. I do not have to pretend to be a broken, senile old man anymore. My mind is sharp, my hands are steady, and my days belong entirely to me. I walk into the kitchen and place my empty coffee mug on the pristine marble island. The very same counter where she once slammed down a forged quitclaim deed is now just a quiet place to prepare my breakfast. The storm she brought into my life has passed completely, leaving behind a clear blue sky and a deep, enduring peace. I spent my entire life believing that family was the ultimate load-bearing wall of a person's existence. I always thought that because we shared the same blood or the same name, I was permanently obligated to carry absolutely whatever weight they decided to place upon my tired shoulders. Society constantly conditions us to forgive our relatives, no matter how deeply or maliciously they cut us. We are repeatedly told that a parent's love must be completely unconditional from the cradle to the grave. But sitting here in the quiet peace of my home, I have realized a profound truth. Unconditional love should absolutely never require your unconditional surrender. Loving someone deeply does not mean you have to stand still and allow them to completely destroy your life. When I walked into that lavish country club and permanently dismantled her criminal empire, I did not feel the hot, burning thrill of revenge. Vengeance is a chaotic and reckless emotion. It is a wild fire that burns the innocent right along with the guilty. What I sought was simple structural justice. When a heavy steel bridge is actively failing, you do not ignore the cracking metal out of some misplaced blind loyalty to the original design. You immediately condemn the failing structure to save the innocent people trying to cross it. I had to condemn my daughter-in-law to protect myself and to protect the rest of the world from her unchecked greed. I had to draw a hard, permanent boundary in the concrete. Through this nightmare, I learned the absolute hardest lesson a father can ever learn. Sometimes, the very people you would gladly take a bullet for are the exact same people standing right behind the trigger. Loyalty is a precious currency that must be earned through consistent mutual respect and genuine human care. It is not something automatically inherited through a piece of paper, a marriage certificate, or a shared family tree. Vanessa firmly believed my advancing age made me weak, and my profound grief made me blind. She thought my quiet silence was simply permission for her ongoing cruelty. But wisdom is the ultimate silent advantage of growing old. We survive decades of hardship by learning exactly when to hold on tightly and exactly when we must completely let go. I chose to let go of the comforting illusion of my perfect family. I accepted the cold, hard reality that not all blood deserves your loyalty, and not every relative deserves a place at your table. I am no longer the helpless victim of a tragic story. I am the sole architect of my own peace. My foundation is finally completely secure, the toxic elements have been permanently removed, and I am completely ready for whatever quiet chapters come next. I step out onto my front porch, pulling my worn cardigan tighter against the crisp morning breeze. The neighborhood is quiet, the kind of ordinary suburban quiet that I will never take for granted again. I walk slowly down the concrete driveway, listening to the familiar crunch of dry autumn leaves beneath my boots. I reach the old aluminum mailbox standing at the edge of the curb. I pull open the squeaky metal door and reach inside. There is a handful of colorful grocery store circulars and a few standard utility bills. But buried right in the middle of the junk mail is a single piece of thick, glossy cardstock. I pull it out and turn it over. There is absolutely no return address written on the back. There is no message, no signature, and no explanation. But my eyes immediately lock onto the faded ink of the postage stamp. The black postmark stamped heavily over the corner clearly reads, Zurich, Switzerland. I flip the postcard back over to look at the front image. It is not a glossy tourist photograph of snowy mountains or city streets. It is a simple hand-drawn sketch done in dark charcoal. It is a meticulous architectural drawing of a steel suspension bridge spanning across a wide, deep canyon. A slow, genuine smile spreads across my wrinkled face. I trace my thumb over the rough charcoal lines. It is the exact same bridge design I taught my son to draw at the kitchen table when he was just 10 years old. It is a structural masterpiece designed to withstand any storm. He is alive. He is completely safe, and he knows that the monster hunting him has been permanently locked away. I slide the postcard into my breast pocket right next to my heart. I turn around and begin the short walk back to my front door. Some ghosts do not haunt us. Some ghosts cross the ocean, leave us the truth, and wait patiently for the day we can finally build a bridge to find them again. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and trust must be earned rather than blindly given. We are often taught to sacrifice everything for our family, but true love should never demand the destruction of your own security or peace of mind. Arrogance and greed are loud and chaotic, but true strength lies in patience, observation, and the quiet calculation of the truth. When you find yourself surrounded by deception, the most powerful weapon you can wield is not anger, but absolute silence and the courage to protect yourself at all costs. If you found value in my journey of reclaiming my life, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of survival and justice.